Hey everyone, how's it going? So today's video is going to be a general overview about aperture and how aperture affects depth of field and your exposure. So hang on and let's dive into it. Aperture, it's nothing more than the opening that will allow the light to travel through your lens and reach the sensor of your camera to produce the image. So nothing more, nothing less than that, okay? The number used to describe the aperture is called f-stop or f number, and usually it's described as f / and the number, or f number. And that's where sometimes it gets a little bit tricky, because the smaller the number, the larger is the aperture. So what I like to think is just, let's think that these are inches, okay? Inches. Just like take off the F and put a 1 there. And so like you have a half an inch and you have quarter of an inch. So even though the F2 is a smaller number than F4, we can think about it being like half an inch and a quarter of an inch. So now you can kind of relate that the f2 is going to be a larger aperture than the f4. And the same works for f4, f8, f11, f16, and whatever, okay? It's just an easier way to think about it and to try to memorize it. It's not a big deal. You're just going to get used to that. It just takes a little bit of practice, okay? So let's say we have the same scene. I'm not changing light, I'm not changing the composition, the ISO or the shutter speed, which are also other stuff that will interfere with your exposure. Let's say that I have an f2 and an f4 and an f8, okay? 3 different pictures. The f2 is going to be brighter than the f4, and the f4 is going to be brighter than f8, because the aperture is going to be larger on the f2 and really smaller on the f8. So what that means, the aperture f2 is going to allow way more light to hit the sensor than the f8, for instance, which is way smaller aperture. So that's the way the aperture is going to interfere with your exposure. If you have light, the same other conditions, nothing's changing, and you have a larger aperture, f2, f1, 1.2, 1.4, it's going to be brighter than f8, f11, okay? Let's jump into Photoshop. I took some 3 pictures about a little scene that I created here at home, just to try to illustrate how aperture is going to affect the shot, okay? Let's jump there. So this is a simple composition that I prepared for this video. Here I'm shooting using f2. You can see that the image is pretty much well lit and exposed. If you change for f4, keeping the ISO and shutter speed at the same, you can see how darker the image is turning. And when we shift to f11, the image is pretty much a black frame. So talking about now depth of field and how aperture will affect the depth of field. You probably have seen landscape photography, and usually the whole scene is sharp. You have details from the foreground all the way to the background. You have a good detail. There are other techniques that can be used, but let's just talk about aperture right now, okay? Why everything is sharp? It's because it's usually for landscape photography, we're going to use apertures like 7.1, 8, 11. So you have a very broad depth of field. It's not, it's different when you're trying to shoot a portrait, for instance, when you want the model, the person, to be the focus, and nothing else can be distractive. So you kind of try to blurry to have like this beautiful blurry background, and then it will make the portrait and the person pop more. One of the things you can do is to use wider aperture size, because that will allow you to narrow the depth of field and really focus on your subject. Okay, once again, I took some shots here just to kind of illustrate how the aperture will affect the depth of field. So let's go back to Photoshop and I will show you that. So just to illustrate how aperture will affect the depth of field on these pictures, I varied the shutter speed to keep the exposure roughly the same across all the three pictures. Okay, so this one is f2. You can see that the only really sharp area on the picture is this area here. All the rest is kind of blurry and the lens is pretty much just a black blob. Going to f4, you can see that there is way more sharpness here in the foreground. The cactus is still a little bit blurry and the lens is still blurry, but you can see a little bit more details here. And f11, everything here in the foreground is tack sharp, and you already have way more details here on the background as well. So that's the way aperture will affect the depth of field when you're taking pictures. So there you have it, guys. That's basically what aperture is and how it affects your photography. So if you didn't do that yet, just hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next video.